Okay, I'm not sure why it's showing the little chat screen. Okay, so hi everyone. Thank you so much to Hunter and the English department for hosting us today. We're very privileged to be part of the inaugural lecture for 2023. We're going to be talking to you about quite a new project that Xany and I have started putting together, and it is an interdisciplinary project. We're trying to work on that as much as we can, and it is also linked to a further project that we'd like to put together, which is to start a reading group on some or around the field of environmental humanities. So we would like to take this opportunity to invite anyone who is interested in any kind of ecological and environmental studies from any discipline to please contact us so that we can start putting names down and start organizing our first get-together to read. So please do contact us during the or after this this talk. And as Hunter said, we'll be talking about something that's quite close to both of our hearts. And it's specifically looking at urban wildlife photography, which Xany will explain in more detail during the course of the talk, as a form of what we refer to as solastalgia, which is a sense of distress or despair in place with environmental degradation. And we're specifically going to be looking at a critical approach to it because it is something that is problematic and that needs to be urgently addressed. And the way that we would like to put forward as a potential way to do this is what we'll present today. And we want to also expand this into a larger project in which, which is sort of not limited by the length of an article. So Xany, you can take it away.
All right. Navigating to, sorry, I'm just trying to skip the slide, which is not working. There we go. All right, so it needs a mouse. All right, so this is based on a paper that was supposed to have been finished, but Helen and I are quite good at leaving things for the last minute, which is probably why we work so well together. But neither, there, let's start. So, urban wildlife photographers. Oh, and throughout this presentation, you'll see photos of urban wildlife. So we might not necessarily talk about the image, but you can have an image to look at while we talk. So urban wildlife photographers attempt to visually capture non-human animals navigating urban environments. And while global efforts are being made to rewild urban areas, many cities are still lagging behind in attempts to create hospitable urban environments for local wildlife. As a result, many non-human animals who live in urban spaces, often in close proximity to humans, purposefully remain hidden or at least seldomly interact with humans. By taking an ecosemiotic theoretical approach, we have attempted to provide a critical conceptualization of photography as a visual translation of solastalgia experienced by non-human animals in the more or less non-rewilded urban spaces. As with other forms of wildlife photography, urban wildlife photography attempts to visually represent the ways in which wildlife interact with and navigate their habitats. However, rather than depicting the vast range of affordances offered by the natural world, contemporary wildlife photographers often aim to document the invasion of modernity affecting humanity and the environment. Falling under this category, urban wildlife photographers therefore not only document the non-human animals, but also attempt to portray the loss of belonging as a result of urbanisation or human settlement. Against this background, then, this paper attempts to conceptualize urban wildlife photography as intersemiotic translation, which we'll get into a little bit later, by reconceptualizing the photographer as a translator who acts as a mediator in an experiential process that allows the recipient, which includes the viewer, the listener, the reader, or the participant, to recreate the sense of the source artifact for him or herself. And this was said by Bennett. By focusing on the loss of place and belonging experienced by non-human animals in urban ecologies, in particular, then this paper intends to ecosemiotically explore the posthuman role of urban wildlife photography in the Anthropocene as translation of solastalgia. Originally defined as by Glenn Albrecht as the distress that is produced by environmental change impacting on people while they are directly connected to their home environment. Solastalgia, we argue in this paper, should be extended to include the experience of the non-human animal as well. Photography, it's furthermore argued critically depicted and translated to a human audience. To argue this, we'll cover a range of topics in this presentation. Amongst the most prominent are the approach to ecosemiotics and semiotics. The background is actually the introduction. I'm sorry, I forgot to change that. And then explain what is meant by translation in our terms, and specifically intersemiotic translation. Then Helen will talk about photography and provide a more conceptual framework, philosophical framework on photography. And where I'll build on there with a short description or discussion of urban wildlife photography. And after which then Helen will bring all of this into solastalgia and solastalgia beyond the human. And after this, we'll attempt to bring our thoughts together. Sorry, next one. So that was just said. I'm sorry, I forgot that we had that slide. So semiotics, or the study of sign processes, entails the study of meaning. In the 19th century, 19th and 20th centuries, linguist Ferdinand de Saussure and semiotician Charles Peirce, unbeknownst to each other, both developed intricate theories of signs. The former focused purely on linguistic semiotics, from which the European school of thought of semiology developed. While the latter argued that semiotics isn't a purely linguistic phenomenon, and argued that a sign is anything, both verbal and non-verbal, which stands to somebody or something in some respect or capacity. A sign, or in Peircean semiotics, a sign has three elements. The representament, which is the sign vehicle that links an object to an interpretant, an object that to which the sign refers, and then the interpretant, which is the effect of the sign. So this figure shows the sign in as a triadic relationship between the three previously mentioned elements, for which a process of meaning creation needs to take place if the sign is made, or if the sign makes sense to the aforementioned somebody. Ultimately, semiosis is a continuous process where one sign follows on another sign to create a process of meaning, or to form a process of meaning making. In terms of the photograph of this pigeon, for example, then the representament would be the photograph. So in other words, the sign is the photograph. The object would be that particular pigeon outside of the photograph, or those particular pigeons, more than one. And the interpretant would then be the effect of the photograph on the viewer. We all have different opinions of pigeons, especially as those in our urban environment. And in this light, then, it becomes evident why it has been argued then that the sign can be understood as a mediator. It's a connector between various aspects of the world. So as such, then, semiosis isn't a singular occurrence, but rather a continuous process, which I've said, in which each of the elements can become any of the other elements. I apologize for my bird screaming in the background. I'm hoping you don't hear it as clearly as I do. Simply put, the representamen can become the object, which can become the interpretant, and then become the representamen again. Semiotician Floyd Merrill uses an analogy of an image in a textbook to show how this takes place. And I'm going to read this. So see this image, and I'm hoping I actually, no, I didn't. No, hopefully I can come back. Oh, there we go. So I'm going to read what he says. A representamen can be a caricature of Winston Churchill found in a history textbook. The semiotic object can be Churchill at Yalta in Russia in 1945, when he was seated with Franklin Roosevelt and Joseph Stalin. The interpretant of the sign consists of the relation between the caricature and the actual figure caught up in an earth-shaking historical event. Subsequently, Merrill says, the semiotic object, Churchill as a physical specimen of humankind, can become a representamen whose whole own semiotic object is his skull in the photograph at Yalta. The interpretant becomes pride and persistence in the effort to defeat what Churchill conceived as terrible destructive forces. Or perhaps the original interpretant, Churchill at Yalta, can become a representamen. In such case, the Yalta conference itself can become a semiotic object, and the interpretant has to do with the outcome of the meeting between the three world leaders. I know this is very complex, but I hope the gist of it did come across. To the extent of our knowledge of the Second World War, the purpose of images, even textbooks, the Yalta Conference, and so much more allows for the initial interpretant, the relationship between the image and the original event, to develop in the way it does. And this will be discussed in more detail in subsequent sections. So Merrill says that signs evoke and provoke more signs, which in turn then bring on more signs without end. And he uses the terms translations when referring to these transformations of signs. And this is when the meaning of a sign takes on a different meaning, depending on the set of experiences and expectations of the interpreters of that particular sign. Then linking with translation, several scholars have referred to the interpretant as the translation of the sign. And since all translation then is semiosis, which we'll see a little bit later, this should then be the case. An interpretant, however, does not have to be purely a cognitive reaction. It can be an action or an object, which we argue then a photograph becomes the interpretant of the photographer, and then eventually the representamen to the viewer. And so this then kind of sets in motion this eternal semiosis. As an ecologically focused branch of Persian semiotics, ecosemiotics then explores semiosis between humans and the natural environment. In particular, it explores the relations between cultural phenomena and the environment and analyzes their types, their hierarchy, outcomes, and dynamics, as Maran and Tuha said. As a theoretical field, it can be applied across various disciplines, and its relevance to a study such as this lies in its ability to transcend Cartesian conceptual dichotomies, such as the nature-culture, society-nature, and even mental-material divide. In doing so, then, it eclipses the conceptualization of nature as purely material and human society as purely communicative, and recognizes these systems as integrated systems that are both material and communicative, as Alf Hornberg said. Linking with this, then, Timo Moran, an ecosemiotician, argues that cultural creativity and material realities are not seen here as excluding or conflict with in conflict with one another, but rather their encounters are the very condition for the meanings and significance to unfold. An ecosemiotic approach to studying human-nature interaction, or translation in our instance, would then enable an analysis of the translational process as meaning-making process, as communicative process, without the burden of dualism. Intersemiotic translation can, within this framework, be regarded as a process of making visible the interconnectivity between nature and culture. In 1959, Roman Jakobson famously distinguished between three types of translation: interlingual translation, intralingual translation, and intersemiotic translation. Interlingual is translation between two or more languages. Intralingual, also known as rephrasing, is translation within the same language. And intersemiotic translation is translation between verbal and non-verbal modes. Obviously, the first two focus on linguistic aspects, and the last one, the third one, is the focus of today's paper. Since Jakobson's distinction, many scholars have attempted to explore intersemiotic translation in several fields of thought, and these include fields of semiotics, of translation, of media, of performing arts, and cultural studies, amongst many others. And while Jakobson initially included language in his definition of intersemiotic translation, contemporary approaches to this process do not regard language as an essential component, thereby giving equal weight to nonverbal aspects of meaning making. Biosemiotician translation scholar Magle summarizes this shift in perspective quite nicely, and he says, and you can follow on the slides there, from a semiotic perspective, translation is not a process that takes a structure, like text, as its point of departure, and then tries to destructure and restructure that structure into a different structure. Rather, translation is a process that creates relationships between existing meanings and thereby creating new meanings. Translation is therefore a continuous process in which meaning is created and conveyed. So intersemiotic translation ranges from verbal translation of something visual, like the poetry of Gertrude Stein, who applied visual elements of cubism in her poetry, to the conversion of a book into a film, or even ballet as translation into a kinesthetic or visual medium of a work previously encoded in verbal or musical form. Such instances of intersemiotic translation are purposeful processes which were executed with the purpose of changing the semiotic source of the meaning. However, by equating translation to semiosis, we can bring to light translation as a process of meaning making and shift away from translation as a pure product. And Susan Petrilli, for instance, proclaims that translation is everywhere, on the basis that if meaning making takes place, translation takes place. And similarly, Magle argues that Tom, Dick, and Harry, as well as Fido and Puss in Boots, are translators, in a similar approach to Petrilli, in that if translation equals meaning making, then not only can the non-verbal be translated, but non-humans can also be translated and translators. These scholars build on the threefold distinction by Jakobson in translation by arguing that translation can be equated to semiosis, or to meaning creation. In this instance, rather than moving from one instance of meaning, such as the source language, into another instance of meaning, such as the target language, translation is regarded as the very process that drives the meaning, the process through which meaning emerges, as Mary says. And it is within this frame of thought that we approach this paper. Translation is a continuous process, and photography as translation is then a continuous process from in meaning creation and meaning transfer. And then based on this, photographs can serve as translations of many things. And one of those things then is exploring the idea of solastalgia, or the experience of solastalgia, visually. And in the next section of this talk, Helen will delve into the concept of photography, and the photographer as both active agent of meaning making and engaged experience. And this will then add even more layers to this process of meaning making.
Thank you, Xany. So I'm going to now be giving a short discussion on sort of a philosophical interpretation, pretty much of what Xany's laid out here. And we're going to specifically be looking at the concept of photography as translation through the work of the German critical theorist Walter Benjamin, who wrote most of his texts in the 1930s and 1940s. So how do we connect intersemiotic translation, as Xany's already mentioned, with photography as engaged experience and meaning making? We argue there are important insights to gain from German philosopher Walter Benjamin, which add immense philosophical depth to understanding photography not merely as a disinterested art form, but rather that photo taking has the ability to change us as human beings as well. Benjamin's work is dense and often tricky to interpret in a single way. As such, we're going to only focus on a few points that relate specifically to the role that Benjamin gave to photography as interpretation and translation of experience. Three notable points will be addressed here. First of all, how human perception is transformed through photography. Second, the photographer as an active agent in capturing and sharing experience. And thirdly, the role of photography in social and political transformation, which is ultimately the end goal of trying to understand urban wildlife photography as a way to help us to see things in a different way, to see the experience of the non-human as well as just the human when the environment is destroyed. So the analysis then draws from and provides a recast to Walter Benjamin's theory in photography in texts such as Experience, written in 1913, 1914, News of Flowers, 1928, Little History of Photography, 1931, and the very difficult, intricate, but enormously influential work, the work of art in the age of technical reproducibility. Okay, so we can switch to the next slide, sorry. I'm first going to look then at what Benjamin said about the transformation of human perception in relation to photography. And he claims then that photography can reveal to us entirely new things about the most ordinary objects, meaning that the camera allows us to see the world in this way, which leads to the idea of transformation of human perception in particular. Whether we accelerate the growth of a plant through time-lapse photography or show its form in 40-fold enlargement, in either case, a geyser of new image worlds hisses up at points in our existence where we would least have thought them possible. Not sure why there's a little screen popped up here. Okay, well, I can't get rid of it, so. Okay, so that is the emphasis of this particular aspect is exactly what I mentioned there, the transformation of human perception through the photographic image. The person who creates collection, for example, of plant photographs according to Benjamin, he says, can eat more than bread. He has done more than his share of that great stock-taking of the inventory of human perception that will alter our image of the world in as yet unforeseen ways. What Benjamin tries to highlight here is that photography has the potential to change us as human beings through the perceptions that we have and that we create of the various images. In Benjamin's commentary on Carl Blossfeld's originary forms of art, the photographic images of plants, Eli Friedlander notes that Benjamin conceives of the relationship between the human and the non-human world in the human capacity to, quote, heed the mute language of nature and realize it in his own language. And this is exactly the kind of intersemiotic translation that Xany and Jacobsen, through Jacobsen, mentioned earlier. This creates a critical task, which is that of using human language to respond to communication of the non-human, to address anew this communication in a world of increasing technology. Benjamin is thus seeking such a new way to conceive of technology, such as photography, to allow for the expression and realization of these communicative systems, rather than generally viewing technology as wholly subjugating nature. In other words, while it is quite important to criticize the role of technology in, for example, the very destruction of the environment, we can also use technology in the form of something like photography to create new awarenesses of exactly what is happening. Photography is thus an experience between not only subject and object, but also those who view it. There's a constellation of experience, signification, judgment, a collective product that recenters experience instead of consumption. As such a form of criticism is a sociable art. For Benjamin, I quote, a geyser of these new image worlds hisses up at a point of our existence when we would least have thought them possible. And this occurs when images of nature emerge that are not merely a collection or dispersed multiplicity, but come together in the unity of belonging to the same world. In other words, we are part of the world that we are photographing. We are not separate from it. We are intimately interconnected with it. So how does Walter Benjamin then see photography as a representation of an object to revitalize meaning creation between the photographer, object, and viewer? Benjamin writes of the great surveyor, or the overview, the Unterprüfung of the inventory of human perception, to which the natural photography, such as Blossfeld's flowers, contributed. Friedlander notes that for Benjamin, the primal images resting in nature can be revealed, or better, realized in art, rather than by direct observation of nature itself. The technology of the camera contains the ability to see things, both physical and psychological, that are invisible to the human eye, and this is what Benjamin calls the optical unconscious. In his little history of photography, Benjamin writes that, I quote, "It is through photography that we first discover the existence of this optical unconscious, just as we deliver the instinctual unconscious through psychoanalysis." So in other words, we can see smaller things, we can trace back various things, we can see the minute details, just as we do through something like analyzing dreams in psychoanalysis. Details of structure, cellular tissue, with which technology and medicine are normally concerned. All this is, in its origins, more native to the camera than the atmospheric landscape or the soulful portrait. Yet, at the same time, photography reveals in this material physiognomic aspect image worlds, which dwell in the smallest, meaningful, yet covert enough to find a sanctuary in waking dreams, but which enlarged and capable of formulation makes the difference between technology and magic through and through historically variable. This revealing is experienced as experience. In other words, photography allows one to recognize aspects of what is already visibly given to us in an experience, but which we are generally unconscious of. In an interesting move, Benjamin posits that it is within the experienced that photography makes room for the recognition of that intelligence, which is not a matter of consciousness, that is the intelligence of nature. Benjamin puts it in another context. We discover our conviction that we have experienced infinitely more than we know about. These allow us, in other words, these are what are accessed through our engagement with a photograph. Heinz Popper notes that photographs are never inert objects rendering reality objectively, but always meet the viewer in the context of signification. What mattered to Benjamin is that photography had to be a means to an end, a means for discovery, to create a new means of perception, to reveal the factors that make the facts. And the priority for him was unequivocally the uncovering of the brutal realities of the social and political aspects of his day. What matters in photography is the product. Does it serve purpose? Does it reform consciousness? In other words, the photograph is a collective product. Okay, you can skip to the next slide. The second aspect then that we'll be looking at is the photographer as an agent of experience sharing. So for Gusserl, what makes photographically captured moments so powerful that they stay with us as a form of after image, even if they have been evoked in another medium, such as language? In other words, photography has the ability to reignite experience through photography. Representation itself is dependent upon memory through language, symbols, stories, and texts. Representation is thus mediated, interpreted, and articulated before it is represented through something like a photograph. For example, in relation to externalized mnemotechnologies, such as the photographic camera, Alison Landsberg lauds the potential of technology as what she terms a prosthetic memory, in that it is able to assist in creating what she calls transferential spaces, in which the individual is encouraged through an experiential mode of immediacy to witness memories of events through which one did not live, and which have been derived from a mass-mediated experience of a traumatic event of the past. Katharina Niemeyer agrees with this argument and extends it further in stating comprehensively that representation is in its nature an artificial form. By drawing on the observations of other theorists, such as Boehringer, Ricoeur, Deleuze, and Bergson, she asserts the following: what is gone can only be reenacted, repeated, reconstructed, reshown, rethought, and restored by an artificial act, by mimesis. In other words, what is past comes along with the present via representation. A present that contradicts part of its actualization and can include imaginations of the future. And it is through these sorts of representations which show us aspects that we are not aware of, not conscious of, and that also provide us imaginations of the future, that we argue we can come to see photography, we can come to see nature itself as experiencing what we refer to as solastalgia, which I'll expand on in a bit. It is important to note also in Benjamin's later work, so in the artwork essay, he cautions against, for example, the techno-appropriation of art as experience, especially in his critique of the empty, spiritless and unartistic experiences over a life merely lived through with that kind of experience. He calls this the crisis of experience, which aims dialectically to redeem the concept of experience, which theorists such as Giorgio Agamben note that we have essentially lost in modernity, but Benjamin feels can be recaptured through photography. In other words, photography can revivify experience. And one of the ways in which we do it is, if you go to the next slide, considering the notion of marked sites by Robert Smithson and Michael Heitzer. This is a term employed by art critic Rosalind E. Krauss to describe works in which landscape and not landscape coincide. Unlike the Earthworks project of the late 1960s, which is the photograph that you see here, which tended to employ the non-landscape as the focus of the landscape, this confrontation between nature and urban spaces opens up an instance of the landscape scoured into the city, where it could not be previously experienced or easily imagined. Defining such a physical boundary, whether corresponding to sea level rise or to climate change, is not an encounter with the power of nature so much as an encounter with the limits of experience in the face of trauma. And you can go to the second slide there. So in this, you can see, as opposed to the previous slide, you have the spider as in the foreground to the cityscape of the background. And by foregrounding something like wildlife, in this case a spider, it opens up and reestablishes these boundaries. And it can bring into focus the trauma of wildlife in a place like a city, instead of foregrounding the city as a place in which wildlife merely dwell. This is where the wildlife is foregrounded, and the city is seen as this invasive, sort of looming background over the natural place, which is the spider web in this context. Okay, can you go to the next slide? So, photography as a catalyst of social and political change. This is the very third and very important aspect that we're going to be drawing from Walter Benjamin. He pays immense attention to the importance of how we relate to photography politically and socially. Benjamin believes that holding the correct political opinion is not enough, and artists and writers must intervene actively in transforming the forms and institutions of contemporary culture. For the new objectivity, he says, it is the economic function of photography to bring to the masses elements which they could not previously enjoy, spring, movie stars, foreign countries, etc., by reworking them to the current fashion. It is the political function of photography to renew the world as it actually is from within. In other words, in the way that we understand according to contemporary trends. Photographers must become writers and vice versa. The photographer becomes an active participant in meaning making. So to an even degree, what mattered then to Benjamin was that photography had to be a means to an end, as I've mentioned already, in that it reforms consciousness. The camera also for Benjamin doesn't have necessarily an essence of its own. It cannot perform miracles. It cannot perform the miracle of objective renditions of reality. The camera cannot tell a lie, but that is because it cannot speak. It performs, and it is made to perform by human beings. Its end product then is a result of efforts and judgments by many people, the last of whom is the photographer. And often not even he or she, but the printmaker is the last in the chain. In other words, the photograph is a collective product of collective meaning makings. And this is politically and socially interpreted. And thus the photographer becomes an agent of meaning making for Walter Benjamin. Xany is then going to do the next section on how photography relates to urban wildlife. You need to unmute yourself, Xany.
Sorry. The effect of human action on wildlife is hardly disputable. Humans affect entire ecosystems by changing land cover, using resources, producing waste, and changing native communities of fauna and flora. Overtly noticeable consequences of these actions are urban areas, where natural habitats have almost completely been eradicated to make place for human settlement. The effects of urban sprawl have resulted in these settlements encroaching into animal habitats, and this has resulted in increased interactions and conflicts between humans and animals. We use the term urban loosely here to account for any form of collective human settlement or development, such as city centres, residential areas, informal settlements, and industrial areas. While human settlements have caused many non-human animals to migrate to spaces less populated by humans, some animals still manage to remain in urban areas despite their natural habitats being depleted. The reason for this varies, and the availability of shelter and food are, however, some of the most prominent reasons for them remaining. And conversely, in other areas, climate change has also then forced animals into urban areas, particularly in search of food, for example. So humans then, without being aware of this, are surrounded by numerous animals, ranging from insects to arachnids to avians to reptiles and mammals, amongst others. Ecosemiotically, depending on their general representation by humans, non-human animals are either regarded as pests, such as rodents, for example, or nuisances, pigeons, for example, or even contributors to the human environment, or, well, general environment, but that humans see them as contributing to the environment, such as bees, or just random welcome guests, a bird species, if we put up a bird feeder in our garden. Metaphors to describe these animals range from rats with wings, or pigeons, and then on the other side of the spectrum, welcome garden guests. I don't know if you've seen on covers of magazines how to lure garden guests to your garden. Other ways of describing bird species, insects, welcome insects for in this instance. So then urban wildlife photography tries to show these. The media significantly influences people's knowledge of and perceptions and behaviors towards a particular issue, such as urban wildlife. And we want to say, and go further, go beyond this, and say that photography, which obviously is a form of media, not only creates perceptions, but also translates. Also translates non-verbal circumstances or experiences. And as such, they can often convey and translate what text can't. The idea that photography is unbiased and objective is also dated, as Helen has said. Besides for photography being linked to activism, the biosemiotic and ecosemiotic approach to photography would imply that it not only conveys meanings, but it also creates meanings. And we've said this quite a bit, quite a few times. The photographer not only becomes an intermediary then, but rather a translator of the animal in the urban moment. And then the meaning of that moment. And by capturing exactly what is visible, the photography critically engages with the context. And now it's Helen's turn again to go back to solastalgia and to bring everything in line with that.
Okay. I'm going to try and wrap this up as briefly as I can. So basically, the question that we're asking, can photography, specifically urban wildlife photography, help us to translate a circumstance of trauma into a collective experience through representation? And then we extend that question to ask, can this apply also to the non-human as opposed to just the human? And this is a really important question because it deals with the ability to empathize, to get meaning from the image, to create meaning through one's own photography as well. And this is what Zilka Anodisimine asks, for example, when she queries the images and the text of a museum. She says, for example, are visitors to a museum or to an exhibition primarily asked to imagine how another was feeling or how themselves would feel in the other's place? Are they supposed to feel distressed for the other, as the other, or by the state of the other? These are critical questions to ask when confronted with a moving text, one that is socially and politically provocative. Glenn Albrecht, defines solastalgia as the pain or distress caused by the ongoing loss of solace and the sense of desolation connected to the present state of one's home and territory. It is the existential and lived experience of negative environmental change, which manifests as an attack on one's sense of place. It is quite a new understanding or new concept for understanding the link between human and ecosystem health, specifically the cumulative impacts of climatic and environmental change on and their impact on mental, emotional, and spiritual health. And that's very important to note, because what we're going to do is to talk not merely about the mental, emotional, and spiritual health of the human, but rather the existential flourishing of the non-human animal as well. So while this is important, we want to take the discussion that much further. And I think, Xany, we can already skip to the next slide, because I want to move as quickly as I can. So how do we take solastalgia beyond the human? How do we de-anthropocentrize a concept such as solastalgia? And we don't just want to do this superficially, because we feel that it is a real and important thing to grapple with. In the literature on solastalgia and also in indigeneity, the landscape construct in relation to solastalgia and is also a call to better understand, for example, Indigenous people's lived experience of landscape transformation and degradation in the context of historical traumas. This, again, is very important work that is being done in the field of Indigenous studies. But very little of a similar kind of work is being done in relation to the sense of loss and sense of destruction and existential destruction of the non-human world, the non-human habitat. And if one considers that at the root of solastalgia are words that are, most of the words that are associated with are things like environment, home, distress, and loss, including environmental change words, which are cumulative, compounding, imposed, unwelcome, negative, and so on and so forth. There's no reason why we cannot also conceive of these words as being intimately related to non-human animals. A lot of the work around solastalgia also looks at the emotional health of humans. There are terms such as psychoterratic or earth-related states, ecological grief, eco-anxiety, land health, and so on, which are all, again, very important concepts, but these tend to focus more on the human emotion as opposed to expanding also to the non-human. So solastalgia literature then, as I say, focuses on the mental perceptions, feelings, and experiences of human beings in the face of environmental change. But the literature is lacking in examination of solastalgia as an existential crisis, not merely a mental crisis. Such a discussion could then extend the nostalgia-related concepts of environment and so on beyond the human to the non-human. And Glenn Albrecht also notes that as humans in the early 21st century are beginning in some meaningful sense to see other animals indeed other beings as kin to us, becomes more and more plausible to understand that non-human animals would experience emotions similar to those of humans when their home environments are disturbed. And he says that he has argued, for example, conferences, and there's been a lot of discussion, but not a lot of publication yet, that non-human beings are as likely to be extremely stressed by the imposed changes of trophic mismatches, habitat destructions, and global warming. And thus, he sees no reason why a sense of disorientation and distress in animals should not be called solastalgia. And if we conceive of thinking of it as flourishing, existential flourishing, as opposed to mental well-being, then we can begin to rethink this notion. And if we think of flourishing in the way that Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum speak about the capabilities approach for human suffering, where they identify a number of capabilities that are essential for human flourishing, there is some work that is starting to be done on further developing the capabilities to extend to a non-anthropocentric context. And some of these theorists are Jeremy Bendick-Keimer, Katie Fulfer, Hewlett and Swartz, where they talk about the capacity for flourishing as being necessary to extend it to include so-called non-sentient life, although that notion itself is obviously also debatable. Bendick-Keimer provides an emergent radical potential and capabilities theory to formulate human obligations to the non-human world and illuminate the moral virtues necessary to sustain a biocentric global justice that is also centered around this notion of existential flourishing. Artists and art, which includes photographers, have, we argue, a huge important role in helping others understand what is happening in their surroundings, of seeing these flash images of despair, of distress, ones that could not be seen by the naked eye because they are so quick, or because they are too far, or because we are simply not looking at these things. The photographer can capture these moments, and they are real moments, and they can capture them and they can present them as a way for us to begin to engage in this topic of the sense of destruction and desolation that the non-human feels. Art and crafts help us to see and react to what is most often almost invisible and unspeakable. They bring it to the surface and force us to interact with it. Artists and photographers can offer us a degree of solace with their creations, but, and importantly, they can also heighten our psychic discomfort in the confrontation with environmental disturbance. Xany, you can finish it off.
Again, sorry. So in short and in summary, in a posthuman, post-anthropocentric world, we need to reconceptualize the dualism of the purely human and the purely not human in order to reassess our role and our respective roles towards the positioning within the non-human and human world. One of the ways in which this then can be done is to repurpose processes and activities such as photography, which was also originally regarded as a human cultural activity, as a way to connect the human and the non-human, or ultimately to translate the non-human and the experiences of the non-human for the human. Photography, and in particular urban wildlife photography, then we argue today, can, in line with recent reconceptualizations in fields such as translation, philosophy, critical theory, open itself up to the non-human and to the non-verbal, and be brought into this way of thinking that we are proposing. And the purpose of photography, we argue, has naturally and gradually moved towards this new role in the environment by starting to critically look at the non-beautiful, or which would have been hidden a few years ago, and what would not be regarded as good photography subjects, such as urban wildlife, and then their particular place in the urban environment. And then conversely, our place within the natural environment. And that's it. Can I stop sharing?
Thanks so much, Xany and Helen. This was absolutely fascinating. I want to open the floor now for questions. If you have a question, please just put up your hand and I will give you a chance to speak. Victor, please go ahead.
All right. Well, anyway, I first of all want to say sorry to Xany that we haven't met yet, but here we are. Am I supposed to come on screen? I can, but anyway, not now. All right. I was just thinking, in light of the way urban wildlife photography offers a kind of a challenge or a reinvention of modernity, I wonder whether you might want to consider sort of a pre-modern analogy, especially since, if we talk about medieval or the pre-modern world, where the relationship between the what we say, the wild and the urban environment, and between nature and art are sort of very different. And perhaps in some ways we might feel nostalgic about them rather than solastalgic about them. So I thought, because I was struck by your very first slide, reminded me so much of medieval art, and particularly illuminated manuscripts. And I thought, well, now there's a kind of an interesting analogy that might or might not be something you could pursue, because if you think of all the codes in operation, you've got the manuscript text and the image, you've got the allegory of non-human animals, which is sort of the primary way of reading images of animals, and then also there's a preprint technology, which is so very different from the photograph, but then you get the early printed books with wood blocks and engravings and so on. So I don't know, I'm just, floating a balloon there, but it might be, I mean, you could write a whole book about this, I guess, but I wondered if this had ever had crossed your mind in relation to the sort of things you were talking about here. So thanks for giving me a little moment there.
So I quickly respond. Thank you, Victor. That's, yeah, obviously a very good question. Benjamin grappled with this quite extensively in his work of, well, in the little book of photography and in the work of art, the artwork essay written in, I think it was 39, if I'm not mistaken. And the biggest difference that he points out, which I think is very interesting, is that the later art forms, the reproducible art forms, such as such as photography, have lost what he refers to as the aura. And the aura is that kind of experience in place of an actual original text or of a building. You stand in front of a church and you in that moment, you kind of feel the moment of the of why the builder, the architect built it there in that particular form. You feel the grandeur and so on and so forth. With photography, it's obviously a reproducible art, and it has lost that sense of the aura, which is contained within ritualistic art practices. And initially, you think Benjamin's going to be quite negative about that, and he is to a certain extent. But what he says is it can also give us critical distance to be able to make, to see things, or to make sort of political and social calls about something as opposed to aesthetic calls. So the aura itself, is indicative of an artwork, whereas a reproducible image doesn't have that aura, and it's thus more, it meets us halfway. It's more accessible to the ordinary, average, everyday viewer. I cannot necessarily go to Rome and, you know, look at the Sistine Chapel, but I can see a photograph of it and I can discuss it and so on. So in this context, I tend to agree somewhat in that there is this moment that the photographer captures, and that moment isn't an artistic moment, as Xany mentioned in her conclusion. It's not necessarily beautiful. It's not necessarily a beautiful subject, but it's the reason for capturing it that becomes really important. So yes, I suppose that doesn't actually really answer your question, Victor. I'm sorry, but yeah, but I think the reproducibility, the ability to share it with others all around the world, here and now, is one of the potentials of the photograph to bring about environmental change here and now as well. That's all I have to say.
Thanks, Helen. Our next question is from Rick, and then after Rick, it's Relate, who has a question for you.
Hi, Xany. Hi, Helen. I'm sorry I only joined late. I was teaching till 1, so I only caught the end of that. And what I caught was fascinating. And your comments about the technological affordances, particularly of slow motion photography, stop motion photography as well, made me think of and what that reveals, not only sort of the ideological biases that Benjamin talks about, but what it reveals about different forms of suffering is interesting for me in relation to how one might think of refugee crises all over the world, right? So maybe this is something you addressed, in which case I apologize. But interesting interlocutor is of course Rob Nixon on slow violence, and the book subtitled Slow Violence, the Environmentalism of the Poor. And one tends to think, when you think of his argument is that when you see crises, you see the spectacle of violence. You see the Turkish earthquake, right, or the earthquake that stretches through the region. You see all the suffering, but you don't think of the violence that precedes that in terms of the sort of weakly built structures, the corruption that went on in the background. Now, let me get to my point. One also tends to think about the spectacular animals suffering, right? So, for instance, the koala bears up in the trees during the Australian fires. The canonical image, of course, is the polar bear floating solastalgically then on its little patch of ice. How have you engaged with Nixon's work, and does slow violence, at least this brief recap of it, does that seem to speak to the project you're working on?
I think Helen should probably answer, because that's more her section that she was talking about. But so there's I just wanted to comment on your comment on kind of the suffering we afford animals. For example, I was listening to a radio broadcast yesterday, and is my mic on this time? Yeah. The what's the radio guy called? The DJ was talking about how angry he gets when and that rhino poachers should be publicly hanged or something like that. I can't remember what it was, and I that's exactly what I think you also referred to. It's just in a different context, that there's a speciesist approach to animals, that some are allowed to suffer and others aren't. And I think often in urban environments where we also classify these animals as pests, so we have exterminators to come and murder the poor cockroaches in our houses, but at the same time, the butterflies are allowed to still survive. Yeah, that's more or less what I wanted to just comment on, but I think Helen can maybe answer with regards to the Benjamin relation there, if you want.
Well, Xany, I think you've already made a really good point. I think there needs, and this is one of the approaches of these new sort of capabilities approach theorists, is to look at biocentric justice and to try to highlight that all of these aspects have backgrounds. They're all interconnected in different ways, and different aspects, different things may need different forms of justice to kind of deal with them, and it's not uniform. It's not one way of looking at it all. And then it becomes more complex. It becomes more multi-layered. What led up to the massive amount of destruction in Turkey? It was bad building. So it's not just rebuilding the buildings. It's then also looking back. How do you reform laws? How do you sort of look at justice in a more holistic, to sound really cheesy, and I hate what's coming out of my mouth right now, but sort of in a more holistic fashion. But that sounds really awful. I haven't read the book that you've mentioned, and I will certainly read it. I think it's really important to note what I do like about Benjamin is that he kind of mixes this Marxist approach of understanding the ideological bent together with purpose and intent and potential of something like photography. So thanks, Rick. If you can just maybe WhatsApp me the Rob Nixon, Slow Violence. Yeah, awesome. Thank you.
Okay, so relate is next, and then after relate, it's Mark.
Hello, thanks for the talk. My question pertains to the broader aims of your project. I read in between the lines that you both love animals, and you just mentioned a biocentric approach, Helen. So I'm wondering a couple of things, and I hope I draw the strings together. But would it for this project not make sense to perhaps also get a zoologist or an animal behavioralist on board for the broader project? I ask because emotions in animals like distress or love or empathy is easily perceivable. Something like dislocation, I think, is harder to prove. I think one should be cautious of assuming emotions in animals. Obviously, they have them, but it would be better to prove them through a more transdisciplinary sort of approach. The term non-human is to an extent anthropocentric. So yes, I was wondering, would you call up some people from the natural sciences too? And what do you hope to achieve? Thank you.
So with regards to calling up people from the natural sciences, the field that one of my colleagues and myself kind of work in is the field of biosemiotics, which is more or less equating human and non-human meaning making and semiosis, and trying to close that divide. And we are holding, I can actually advertise this here as well. We're holding a conference next year in July, the annual gatherings in biosemiotics on our campus. And we've been trying for years to get the natural sciences involved in these types of approaches. And these types of studies. The biosemioticians in general are biologists, probably more something that we don't know yet in South Africa. So the biologists in South Africa aren't very open to humanity in general. But it is certainly something we are open to especially that's also why we want to start this reading group is to see who's involved and expand that. And then with regards to the issue of the human non-human, it's definitely anthropocentric and trying to find something where you at the same time kind of argue for this movement on a continuum rather than two polar opposites or dualism in people and animals is is a bit contradicting, and we're still trying to figure that out. And that said, there is a lot of from the animal turn that's been taking place and the shift in environmental humanities, a lot of studies that have been done on human, non-human animal interaction and approaches and all of that. I'm hoping I'm answering your question.
Thanks, yes. Thanks. I must also ask that you excuse me. I teach in a little bit, but thank you.
If I can just quickly respond as well, our project is to form a good theoretical foundation of how we want to approach, or a strong theoretical foundation of what we can do with this, and then to take it out to projects that are happening in the Free State first of all, and to there involve farmers, to involve natural scientists and so on. But we first need to establish a solid theoretical foundation. And this is the one that we are trying to do, this ecosemiotic in translation as solastalgia. So we ourselves, I don't think I claim to try and interpret animal emotions at some stage, but there are other theorists who do that kind of work in particular, specifically. But it's not just animals, it's also things like environments and ecologies that are being destroyed that we also want to try and understand. Now that becomes even more complex if you think of, and that's why the shift from emotion, I think, needs to be made to existential well-being. So it's not just about the emotion as we recognize them, anger, hate, distress, and so on, but rather, are these things flourishing or not flourishing? And I think that's the important move that we're trying to make as well.
Thank you.
Thanks, Relate and Helen and Xany. Next question is from Mark.
Good afternoon. Thank you to both presenters for a thought-provoking paper. I've got two interrelated questions, and I suppose one's more of a comment. I think I would have appreciated if you could, within your presentation, provide the audience or reader with a normative framework from which you're approaching the phenomenon in question. You allude, and I think Roulette was mentioning it, you talk about some kind of an ecosystemic justice. What does that entail? What is it that you want this kind of urban photography to engender within the viewer? That therefore allows the audience to appreciate what the goals of the projects are, because presumably you have a understanding of what's wrong and what's right, and how it is that photography should be able to kind of mediate that bridge and allow us to reflect upon how it is that we are undertaking our actions and how we are affecting the world around us. So if you could elaborate on that, I'd appreciate that briefly. And then secondly, it's more abstract, almost a contradiction that I would like to hear how you attempt to overcome it theoretically, to transcend the anthropocentric via the human artifice of the camera. In other words, semiotic is about interpretation, as Xany explained. The photographer in question, when doing urban photography, is obviously going to have an agenda while taking a photo. In your project, is that agenda need to be made explicit so that the audience can interpret it in such a manner that he or she is able to understand what it is that's attempting to be achieved, or do you leave that kind of open to the interpreter or the viewer? And as an example, I used the Kevin Carter photograph, the famous one of the vulture and the child, in which what meets the eye there was definitely, the photo is definitely depicting something, but it wasn't the whole truth, right? And I mean, ultimately it led to the man taking his own life as a result of all the pressure and criticism that came his way. So, I mean, yeah, there surely has to be some kind of a interpretative framework which one needs to take on board that acknowledges both, yes, the animals in question, but also the humans in question. And I wanted to know if you're able to elaborate on that. But thank you. I mean, obviously the paper is really good. I'm just being quite nitty gritty here just to see where you can go with this. So thank you.
Okay, sure. All right, thanks for, as always, very probing questions. I am going to try to think about the first one in terms of a normative framework. Yes, that perhaps needs to be made more explicit, as you are well aware, and I think that's why you're hinting this question. As a critical theorist, Benjamin is concerned with suffering and the elimination of suffering in society. And he is also interested in sort of a material understanding of that, the here and the now. What do we, how do we overcome this, not in the next world? But I think that's why I try to include those three aspects of Benjamin. Perhaps I could make the third point stronger, but that is the role of the photographer as an agent of social and political change. And in that context, looking at despair and desolation that is seen through or seen in the process of solastalgia, and to see that as something that is inhibiting human flourishing, and to think of ways in which one could use photography to bring awareness, to bring essentially change to this destruction of flourishing, which is also causing suffering on some existential level. So that is, I think, what I would respond to as the normative framework. And yeah, thanks for pointing that out. It is obviously something that just needs to be made a bit stronger and more clear. It is difficult to fit everything into one paper, which is why we want to turn it into a book at a later stage. Xany, do you want to address the second one?
Yeah. So with regards to so what makes persemiotics or Persian semiotics applicable to this is that the way in which, besides for the fact that any meaning making is then equated to translation, and that translation doesn't start with a source and a target. It's an ongoing process of after, for example, it's something I actually took out of this talk, or maybe I left it in. I can't remember what I said. Where the photographer, upon seeing a let's say an image of the rat in the presentation we did, upon seeing the image, the photographer has already made her translation of the situation by using the camera, which is then an anthropocentric tool, to take that picture, to capture that moment, is another form of translation. The interpretant here becomes a physical act of interpreting. I'm seeing the meaning there. I want to convey that meaning. But in Peircean semiotics, what the viewer sees is not necessarily what the intention of the photographer was. The meaning in that image could be, yes, there was a rat in the street, but my experience as, for example, a rat-loving animal activist would be, oh, that's so cute, whereas someone else who may be coming from a health background might immediately interpret disease. So we haven't gotten as far as looking at the actual motivation behind, or no, let me reword that. We haven't gone so far as, and we would like to, and this I think might turn into a either an ethnographic, probably an ethnographic study where we actually work with photographers and find out whether they have a kind of concept of something relating to solastalgia. Obviously, we don't feel that they think solastalgia when they take a photo of the rat. It's more our argument that this is one of the ways in which this image can be interpreted as a form of translation, as a form of activist translation to a certain extent. I hope that makes sense.
Yes, no, I think I get a better idea of where it is that you would ideally like the project to move towards. And also, I suppose these are just kind of various aspects that will kind of emerge as your project unfolds. But no, it's fascinating. So thank you for a a thought-provoking paper, and I wish you luck in your endeavors.
Could I also just add on to that? Sorry, Hunter, before you jump in there. I think specifically where we want to look at the non-anthropocentric, obviously to kind of keep in mind that, as I said, the studies on solastalgia have tended to look at human responses, human emotions. When it comes to destruction, desolation, homelessness, and so on and so forth. And I think it's very important to realize that we are merely part of a much greater system. We're part of a much greater environment. We're part of a much greater ecological system. We're not the only things that deserve to flourish in the world. I think every natural environment should flourish, and that's, I think, where one looks beyond the Anthropocene to new formulations of that concept. The neganthropocene, for example, as Seelig calls it. It's just there is a lot being done on human solastalgia. I think there's not much being done on non-human solastalgia, and I think that's where we're slotting our research into. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Xany and Helen, again, and thanks so much for all our attendees. Our time is unfortunately up, but thanks, and we hope we'll see you again for our next session. I will obviously send you reminders and spam you, as I always do. But thank you, Xany and Helen. It's been amazing, and wishing everyone a wonderful day further. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Hunter. Thanks for organizing. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.